have become few and far between. To quote Cinzia Aruza, we are not on a train traveling towards universal liberation and equality. Irreversible ecological disaster is actually, at the moment, a more likely possibility than global revolution dispensing with capitalism once and for all. In fact, by connecting us into a world, capitalism has only created the historical possibility for a politics of insurgent universality, not its historical necessity. And to kind of extrapolate why Marxists don't feel like Marxism is inevitable. Since the time of Marx, we've seen one successful communist revolution, that being the Bolshevik Revolution, which was over 100 years ago and which degraded into a state capitalist formation and eventually collapsed after several decades. We also saw the defeat of the Paris Commune in 1871 and the revolution in Catalonia in 1937, as well as the destruction of the Central Workers' Council in Hungary in 1957 and the Solidarność, or however you ever pronounce it, I don't speak Polish, sorry, in 81. And then, as the reading points out, these revolutions failed largely in part to their isolation. Between these failures and the undemocratic top-down state capitalist nature of the USSR, many have been persuaded into a sense of capitalist realism, which, as described by Mark Fisher, is the sense that capitalism is the only viable system and it is impossible to imagine a coherent alternative. However, we Marxists should not feel hopeless. The failures of the left are explicable. Every political disaster is resistible, and we've won victories even though we've not won final victory. And there is now a new left emerging that is very eager for class struggle. Which brings us to what is class struggle? Conflicts in modern society focus on the capitalist mode of production, in which both sides, capitalists and workers, struggle against one another for opposing goals. And I guess I went with capitalist and worker instead of proletariat and bourgeoisie, kind of like what we were talking about earlier with making it more accessible. Marxists believe that class struggle should be revolutionary. And through class struggle, we seek societal change. That's, definitionally what revolutionary means. And that workers are oppressed, the oppressed dispossessed class in capitalism, and must seek to end their own oppression and exploitation, not have it ended for them. To quote Marx, no credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between them. What I did that was new was to prove that the existence of the classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that the dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and of class society. When we understand this, we see that class struggle isn't just about the pursuit of immediate objectives like an increase to wages or benefits, but also is the pursuit of transforming society itself through revolution. So that brings us to the necessity of revolution. We see that revolution is the only way to separate the ruling class from power and from private property. Through class struggle, the working class rids themselves of the muck of the ages, which then in turn develops them into a force capable of remaking the world. This also reveals the need for socialism from below, as workers must learn self-governance, and the central issue becomes identifying obstacles that the exploited and oppressed face in self-organizing. However, there will be forces in the working class that push against revolution. Gramsci warns of subalternity, in which workers develop a dependence on the initiatives of the dominant class, and this manifests itself as passivity and disbelief in collective action, and it is contradictory consciousness that works with the understanding taken from the ruling class. And it's observed in the exploited class as an expression of inevitable defeat within the workers' movement. So that brings us to ideologies. Ideologies are inherently action-oriented. They tell us what the world is like, what standards to apply, and what is feasible. And they are formed through dialogue, not as monads. Ideologies are in constant disorder, though, and they are open-ended and transforming. Because they are provisional, they are tested against experience. And private beliefs may not be reflected in public action. Like people may be more cautious in the face of authority than they are privately. And I say all this to bring us to the idea that perspectives among a class are not homogeneous, they're heterogeneous, and thus collective response must be negotiated within the class. Because ideology is provisional, it is not fixed, and since it is established in the context of ongoing action and dialogue, it is changeable through challenging of social forces and through experiences in social movements. For instance, someone saying we can't strike because so-and-so workers were defeated in this strike can be challenged with the successful instantiation of a strike or a successful instantiation of collective action. So as I briefly mentioned earlier, social movements are heterogeneous. Social movements are formations of oppressed people that are struggling against the conditions of their lives. It tends to be class struggle from below. And social movements are defined within the conflicts in which they emerge. And there, people associate to oppose something, creating organizational links and working in concert to dismantle specific obstacles. And this can happen at various scales. We see it happen, locally with actions that we take, to nationally, like with the George Floyd uprising, to international uprisings like we saw against the Iraq War in 2003. The unity of the movement comes from its shared project, which allows these heterogeneous groups to overcome any intrinsic differences. Since social movements are bodies engaged in popular learning and experimentation, they learn both practically and theoretically. And this develops into debate and then cycles of learning within the social movement itself. This brings me to the concept of the infrastructure of dissent. Political communities are capable of developing social movements that communicate and mobilize together that take various forms, both formal and informal. This infrastructure is built by organizers and can decay and collapse. It must be renewed by every generation. And this infrastructure shapes what is possible for the movement. Many look at the side of trade unions and other infrastructures of dissent from the past and are nostalgic for the size and militancy that those orgs used to have, where striking was more commonplace, forgetting it was a move towards conservatism within these unions that led to the defeats in the 70s and 80s of the labor movement that was not equipped to handle or to fight back against the neoliberal wave. So boundaries between workers' movements and township revolts or social movements serve to weaken them both. The issues that affect workers and then just other social movements are entangled with one another. As Peter Alexander and Peter Pfaff insist, the two kinds of movements, township revolts and workplace struggles, are collective expressions of the working class situation. And they cite in South Africa, where they see it is the protest capital of the world, but the opposition movements are separated from each other. To quote the reading, from 2004, South Africa has experienced a level of ongoing urban unrest, arguably greater than anywhere else in the world, and its strike statistics reveal a higher number of days lost per capita per annum. Although there is sympathy between the two movements, the evidence of unity is minimal. So the two groups here, the employed workers and the unemployed township youth, are actually both part of the working class. One makes up the employed sector, and the other makes up a reserve army of labor, as Marx called it. And so their struggles should be united, yet their individual forms of action are distinct from one another. So this brings us to Katznelson and Castells, who find similar results in the U.S. and Spain, where township and worker movements rarely struggle together despite facing the same foes. And we are seeing that split erode, according to Katznelson. For instance, the example they give in recent teacher strikes in Chicago, strikers have called for improvements for students and taken up issues of social reproduction. And this has led to organizing solidarity from both students and parents. So while heterogeneous movements are segmented in a multitude of ways, all our responses to some general problem that are rooted in a definite mode of production and social relation, and that is to say they are rooted in capitalism. And therefore, movements must reinforce one another, and economic struggle must lead to political struggle, and this must continue as reciprocal action in revolutionary times. So are movements inherently reformist? Charles Tilley's definition of a movement, as given in the reading, a socialist movement consists of a sustained challenge to power holders in the name of those living under their jurisdiction of the power holders by means of repeated public displays of that population's numbers, commitment, and worthiness. This suggests that social movements center on indirect forms of action, which in turn limits the social movement to petitioners and militant lobbyists. Till's mass movements would do nothing to shatter or replace existing power structures. Instead, they make demands of power holders and remain dependent upon the initiative of others. So we, as Trotskyists, would view these movements as inherently reformist. However, this understanding is unnecessary. Movements contain multiple possibilities, which range from petitioning to full-blown revolution. As previously mentioned, it is the debates within the movement, as well as the encounters with opposition, that determine the ultimate character of any kind of social movement. Within social movements, we see protest waves. This is when a movement takes on a mass scale, and the openness of the movement becomes critical in this phase. Political development is marked by political development is marked by and forced forward through political protest waves, and new possibilities are at their highest during these mass movements, like we saw with George Floyd. Mass movements create new challenges and demands, which also require new strategies and tactics, which is where a lot of them end up atrophying and falling away, is that they can't meet these new demands with new strategies. And internal conflicts must be debated and resolved, which is also something that we see as an issue, where one group tends to just take command of any kind of movement, or a coalition, but they're undemocratic. So Trotsky, on the central process of revolution, said the forcible entrance of masses into the realm of rulership over their own destiny, like that is what the central process of revolution is, and mass movements throw the ruling class in disarray. Because mass movements push back against oppression and exploitation, the ruling class must cause their dissolution through either coercion or compromise. And thus, opposition to the movement causes problems within the movement with their threats of either force or compromise that those within the movement find suitable. So what might mass movements become? What qualities of social movements could allow them to become central agents for societal change? Well, imminent with every social movement are individuals who can collectively come together and increase their strength, which allows for radical change beyond the conception of the individual. Participants in mass movements go through leaps in development from passivity to collective action, and then from field worker to militant in the labor struggle. And mass movements and collective action allow citizens to realize our power and role in shaping society. Periods of mass insurgency or protest cycles often lead to innovation in struggle, and the number of people engaged in mass movements also allows for things that were previously inconceivable, like driving the police from the streets, burning down police precincts, or driving out corrupt bosses and union officials. We see that mass movements are able to often establish their own control over various aspects of life. They may occupy spaces and make rules for the use of what has been taken. And they can even take control of building, transportation, media, etc. But the material necessities of the movement can draw new forces in the movement. Like we may see neighborhood committees emerge to defend public safety. And initially, this kind of structure is defensive, but it should be developed to parallel state power. And we've also seen things like nurseries, clinics, schools, which have drawn women into traditionally male-oriented worker struggles in the past, although we've seen the composition of workers change since. But we've seen it draw them into strike spaces as well. The larger increase in collective action sees a larger increase in mutual organization. In periods of struggle, also see more people joining unions, etc. This is important because mass movements must be diverse and reflect all the complexity of social organization and every section and district. And that's quoting Rosa Luxemburg. Movements benefit both in scope and efficacy when including struggles of all oppressed people. And interwoven with other economic and political struggles, being interwoven with other economic, political struggles and economic struggles increases the movement's real diversity and its potential for emancipatory richness. And then according to Jeffrey Weber, movements can have a combined oppositional consciousness, which encourages organizations across locations, sectors, and grievances to unify, finding solidarity with those who are differently oppressed and promoting understanding of the larger system whose manifestations are better understood as a whole together. We see the perception of power shift from the individual to the collective when we come together in these mass movements. And movements involve formations of new organizations and the proliferations of old forms of organizations. So like bodies arise parallel to trade unions, strike committees, to coordinate innovative forms of activity like blockades, which also draws in new layers into the collective activity and allows for new exercises in democratic control and political debate. The victories by the movement will generate momentum and expand the movement's scope, while setbacks may diminish the movement and cause a reduction in the demands or disorientation among the movement participants. So in a movement, we want to build dual power. So we want coordinating bodies, linking organizations and movements, offering real alternatives to existing state power. That and then we want mass movements, or I'm sorry, mass movements do win some gains, but often they win less than their supporters believe is possible. Their victories are limited, and they succumb to repressive response, leading the members to withdraw, and the movement is eventually forced into abeyance. So there are reactionary movements as well as progressive movements, which is generally what we've been talking about so far. And those social movements, obviously have a reactionary character, like we'd see with the KKK or the Nazis. And reactionary social movements reveal weaknesses within the left, such as how different and correct politics need to be articulated and how we need numbers in order to be viable. So within the progressive movements that we've largely been addressing, we'll see intra-movement struggles. Part of the limitation of movements is the resistance of the ruling class, as well as the inner politics within the movement. This returns to the core argument of reform versus revolution. And reformism, expresses resistance to the status quo, but sets limits upon that resistance. And this brings us to the idea of Gramsci's integral state. Capitalists maintain a hegemonic control over society through political and civil institutions, which reinforce bourgeois culture and worldviews at the expense of the proletariat. And the state ends up becoming a network of social relations for the production of consent of the working class. The state gives the appearance that it can be improved. Thus, reformism becomes accepted as a form of common sense. So they view gains as possible, but they have to be limited. And this common sense view of reformism could be argued to be the biggest obstacle to revolution, because as Trotsky says, people turn to revolution when there is no other way. So the root cause of all problems remains capitalism, and under reformism, capitalism is just reformatted. It's not abolished. There will always be voices in a movement calling for negotiation, and these reformist voices will always try to marginalize any revolutionary elements within a movement, as we've seen, in my many years with the Denver Communists now. It is a regular feature in movements that they fracture along the reformist and revolutionary lines. And it becomes a crisis of development with clashes in concepts and leaderships. And there must be an intransigent wing of resisting an intransigent wing that resists subordination, aiming higher and further than the reformists, which must be mobilized wider and allow for the movement to be expansive and democratic. And this allows it to maintain its challenge rather than being a one-off. So on new impulses and possibilities. Over the past decade, the composition of workers and the production distinct to various regions have shifted. For instance, we've seen industrialization and capital shift, so that production is focused on Asia, Latin America, and we see a lot of extraction in Latin America and Africa, while the West now focuses on service and information industries. We've also seen the pressures on workers increase, and we've seen the rise of financialization, in which economies are influenced primarily by unregulated pools of private capital, while debt burdens have forced smaller countries to commoditize parts of their society in order to attract capital and relieve their debt burdens. Alongside this, positively, we've seen for our struggles, we've seen interconnectedness between countries, which leads to new movements and new alliances to form the next new left. And it is its organizing focus may not be just the workplace, but it must also be able to confront the bosses and expand beyond the barriers of previous movements as we move on the path towards liberation.